Someone handed me an old joke here a while ago. It said that there was an old man whose wife passed away, and he was lonely, so he moved into a nursing home. And sitting at the other end of the table was a kind of nice-looking old widow. So he got interested, and after 2 or 3 days of talking, he went up to her and he said, "Will you marry me?" And she says, "Yes." He's so excited, but all night he cannot sleep. Finally, he gets up early in the morning, calls her on the phone. He says, "I'm so sorry. I know that I asked you to marry me, but I just can't remember. Did you say yes or no?" And she says, "I'm really glad you called because I knew I promised somebody, but I couldn't remember who." And many people have kind of felt that way about the church. You leave the world and you come into the church, and then someone says, "Okay, no more of that. No more movies, no more music, no more dancing, no more. And pretty soon you're in this culture with no more friends in the world, no more of the world, and now you are disconnected from reality. That old couple had part of them that still worked. They could still fall in love, but part of them had lost touch. Can that happen with the church? Disconnected from the world. It's always been a hard question. What is our relationship to the world? Because the Bible says, in 1 John 2:15, "Love not the world. If you have loved the world, the love of the Father is not in you." Other young people will say to me, "Pastor Dan, you don't have to be so afraid. We can be in the world. It is possible to be so full of God that no matter what movies you watch, what music you listen to, who you hang out with, you have a filter. And the filter filters out all the sex and the violence and the language and those things that are not part of our beliefs." Jesus obviously could hang out with anybody. So full of God, he could go to the bars, he could talk to the prostitutes, and it just never touched him. He could listen to their jokes and nothing stained his soul. Why can't we have filters like that? Ephesians 6 talks about put on the whole armor of God, and it'll quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. Why not? Why can't we just be filled with God in that way? So what's our relationship with the world, and how do you feel about it? I went rafting. Our family went with another family. We went rafting. And I got sick and was having a tough time, and then the last afternoon, the boat went up on the side and I fell out. And if you were here, you remember I talked a little bit about it the next week. I ended up underneath the boat. And began to run out of air, so I better get that boat off of me. Finally pushed that boat off, finally got up for air, and I pushed my way over to the side, just exhausted. The boat was down another 100 yards. I was scared to get back in the river, and so I decided to climb the rock wall with my wet shoes, terrified that I would fall on the rocks. Finally made it. Does that mean we should not go whitewater rafting because we might fall out? Because there's a risk. Should we not be in the world because there's a risk? No, there are some things that are fun enough that are worth some risk. Can we find a way to somehow stay in the real world and enjoy much of it, and yet somehow be so full of God that it does not stain our souls? First question. Second question I've been wrestling with all week, and this comes from someone in the church, so I don't want to give you many details, but just to say that they had a couple bad experiences with an Adventist church, not here, not even in this country. And so now that we have studied and had come to the place where they admitted they believed, every single one, we read all 28 fundamental beliefs. Do you agree? Yes, yes, yes. Now what? Just cannot bring themselves to accept the name, because accepting the name would be like condoning and approving this other craziness that she had experienced before. She said, "I just can't." And she said, can't you be saved without taking the name? Can't you somehow just believe but stay non-denominational and still be saved? What would you have said? Yes or no? Do you have to take the name? The passage I'm working from today is our last sermon in the series on Acts, because we're giving Garrett the freedom to do whatever he wants next week. Acts chapter 17. If you have a Bibles with you, I'd love to have you just follow along. One of the great sermons in the Bible is the story of Paul in Athens. He's up on Mars Hill. I got to go to Greece when I was young. On our way back to Thailand one time, we had to church. Sabbath morning, we had potluck at the dinner, and then my folks took us to Mars Hill. Here's the Acropolis and Parthenon and all of that. And we spent Sabbath afternoon as 4 little boys climbing over Mars Hill, where Paul spoke. And if you read this passage, you get the idea of what Paul was doing. It says in verse 27, so Paul was standing before the council and addressed them as follows. Evidently, that's what they did. These Epicureans and Stoics, they would go out there and just argue over things. And they heard about Paul and said, come and talk to us. And Paul goes here and he says, men of Athens, I notice that you are very religious in every way. For as I was walking along, I saw your many shrines. And one of your altars had this inscription on it, to an unknown God. This God whom you worship without knowing is the one I'm telling you about. Paul is just not afraid. He is not afraid to stand up on this Mars Hill. He knows that he's as educated as any of them. He knows that he can compete with them. He can play their game. And he knows that he knows their language. He knows their world. He knows their poets. He knows their philosophies. And he knows that he has a God that is better than the gods that they already have. And he's not afraid. He said, Paul's not afraid to walk the streets of the world. And I always use this verse when someone says to me, you know, I'm going to send my kids to a school that's far away, out in the trees in the woods where there's no sin, no evil, no temptation. And I said, Paul was not afraid. Paul could walk the streets of Athens and knew that it would not come on him. He knew he could compete with these people, and his philosophy, he could stand up to anyone. And Paul stands there and defends God. Not afraid. Is it possible to be so full of God? It says in verse 28, in him we live and we move and have our being. In him. Can you be so full of him? It doesn't matter what movies you watch, what dances you go to, who you hang out with, what jokes you hear. It will not come through because the filter is there. Jesus could hang out with anybody and it would not stain his soul. Paul could somehow walk the streets of Athens without fear because he had spent 3 years in the desert hammering out all of his beliefs. He's not afraid. It's not going to touch him. What kind of filters do you have? Paul is just not afraid to stand up and take a stand for God. And he's even not afraid to use pagan poets. This verse, in him we live and move and have our being, is not original with Paul. It comes from a pagan poet. And Paul is so aware of all the pagan culture. He's watched the movies. He knows the culture. He knows the music. And he can use it to connect with the people. And he can take that pagan poet and take it and redeem it and use it for good. And he's not afraid that someone's going to criticize and say, you can't do that. I think of all the years. Celebration Church, they were using overhead projectors. And so we began to use an overhead projector. Oh, people so mad. How can you go and use the tools of the world? Overhead projectors. All the people, when I was a young pastor, Garrett's age, who said, no, you can't use a guitar in church. I was one of the first to play a guitar in church 40 years ago. Drums. You can't use that. That's the world. Paul is not afraid. He says, I will use the things of the world so I can go out on Mars Hill and I can connect with people because I know their language, I know their ideas, I know their world, and my God is bigger and better than their God, and I will win them because I can connect with them with that culture. Not afraid. Not afraid. Why was Paul not afraid? Paul could stand up on Mars Hill Because he says, I've been walking your streets and I saw an idol that was given to an unknown God. Somehow when Paul saw that idol to an unknown God, something happened inside the heart of Paul. That is not okay. I worship the God of the universe, the God of creation, the God of life. And here these people are doing all their gods of stone, and something goes off in Paul's. I cannot let this go by. Why would they have an idol to the unknown God? Because they were afraid that in the pantheon of gods, there would be some God that they had missed because there was no idol for him. And he would be mad, and he would send disasters and terrible things on them. And the gods would be offended. And Paul is so exercised about this. He doesn't care. He's not afraid anymore. And if they give him a Mars Hill moment, he will stand up there and defend God. That's what gives us the freedom from fear, when you absolutely believe that God is not like this. Your God is too small. I cannot let this go by. You have God a little tiny stone. No, the gods are not offended. That is not the way God is. And Paul, the passion rises up in him and he says, let me tell you. I'm going to tell you about this God. God is not like that. Don't you dare worship little gods of stone. Our God is so much bigger than that. Your God is way too small. People think that I'm not afraid anymore. I've done this for 39 years now, preaching. I'm afraid every week. Did you know that? Would you be afraid? Huh? I'm afraid. I was afraid in Tonga. You stand up there in empty seats and trying to find a way to preach. They asked me a couple minutes beforehand to go and pray in front of 2,000 people. I had about a minute to try to think through what to say. I was scared. Scared. I've had moments in Africa. I walked into the hall to preach to 2,000 people and they say, there's no sound. You're going to have to do it without sound. I was scared. They asked me to come and preach to all the employees of a business. I've never done that before. Speak to people. Secular business, give a worship. Will they enter? Do they want to be here? Scared. What gets me through this fear is that I know God is giving me a Mars Hill moment where I get to stand and defend God and say, this is what God is really like. Because I am heartbroken. It was heartbreaking to Paul to see an idol to an unknown God, that they are worried about offending God. And when God is heartbroken, it is heartbreaking to us, and we stand up and speak for God. Amen? That's what gets us out of our fear, out of our insecurities, to say, I have a chance to speak for God. I'm going to do something to defend God's honor. I'm going to make him look good. Do you hear things sometimes that just are a knife in your heart to say, that is not okay. That is just wrong. I remember watching the Olympics, and Dan Jansen, the Olympic skater, he's skating around. He's a world champion. He's got the world record. And he comes in there for 500 meters. It's like a few seconds, and he slips on the last turn, and he slides off the ice. He waited 4 years, came back again as the world record holder and the world champion, and slid again. One strike, you're out. And I watched his wife mouth the words standing at the rink. Came in the newspaper the next day. How could God be so cruel? See, something has to go off in you when you hear that. Somewhere, someone around her had to say, I don't think God is like that. And that is when you have the fear goes away and you have your Mars Hill moment, and you know God is giving you this moment to speak up for God and say, no, he's not like that. He's like this. Your God is too small. That's just not the best picture of God. Not okay. So no fear, not okay. Number 3, there's no other gods. What does Paul say here? He is the God who made the world and everything in it. Verse 24. Verse 25, he himself gives life and breath to everything. He satisfies every need. And then the famous verse, verse 28, for in him we live and move and have our being. Great verse. Paul does not nuke their gods. He doesn't say your gods are useless. Your gods don't count. Your gods can't answer any prayer. He just says, my God made your gods. My God, in him you live and move and have our being. Everything we have comes from my God. What he does, he doesn't leave anything left for them. There's nothing left for his God, those other people's gods to do. My God gives you life and lets you move and gives you your being. There's nothing left. My God is the God you're really looking for. You can look at the gods of this world. There's lots of gods of this world. You can have the gods of sex or travel or money or whatever it is. Things, experiences, travel, sports can all be gods. Even church and religion. It doesn't matter. They're okay. But they cannot be your gods. There is only one God. And Paul says, that's my God. And he is the one. In him we live and move and have our being. There's only one God. You're looking for him. That's what makes Paul brave enough to stand on a Mars Hill when he knows his God is the only true God. Life is only from that God. And then it says, he's hoping we will look for him. And maybe people will seek after God and perhaps feel their way, verse 27, and find him, though he is not far from any one of us. Not far. What does it mean to say he's not far? People go all over looking for God. They go to Buddhism or meditation, or they trying to search for God. They're going to have to think through this big idea, try to find God, try to pray. Pastor Dan, could you come help me? I want to find God. I want to know God. And Paul says, he's not far. We last year had a lot of fun teasing Loma Linda. Sorry, Garrett. This is young adult, not youth pastor, all right? Loma Linda's got, 40,000 Adventists, something like that. And wherever the latest cool place for young adults to go, that's where they all go. And pretty soon people are driving from all over California because they want to get married. They're single. And so they go to this church and they go to the young adult because that's where they hear the best girls are and that's where the coolest people are. And then somehow they will shift to another place. And that'll become the coolest place to go to. And they're driving all over trying to find a relationship. Okay. I've talked to people who I'm marrying here this year and say, how did you meet? And they'll say, well, we met on the internet. We were in a chat room or we joined this thing. And they're going somewhere searching, trying to find somebody. But with God, he says, you don't have to search hard. He's not far. Not far. You don't have to do anything hard. You don't have to master any set of ideas. You don't have to accomplish any certain kinds of things. He's not far. One of the great lines is from a movie that I've really never fully seen. It's called by Jerry Maguire, where this guy's been an absolute sleaze to this wife. And he comes crawling back, and he comes in the back door, and he begins his little speech. I'm so sorry. I have been an idiot. And he goes through this little pathetic speech. If you'll just give me one more chance. And she just says, stop. You had me at hello. You had me at hello. That's all Jesus says. You don't have to do some heroic search. You don't have to master all kinds of thoughts and philosophy. You don't have to learn all that. All you have to do is just flip the switch. I'm here. I'm right here. I'm right here. Not far. Someone comes up to Jesus and says, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Jesus says, are you kidding? You're asking me if I am willing? You think you have to do something to persuade me to be willing? No, I do not have to. You don't have to do anything to persuade me. There's nothing you have to do. I'm right here. I am always willing. You never have to wonder about me. And Paul says, God is hoping you'll find him and you'll search for him. But he's not far. He's not far. And then he says, one last verse, verse 31. For he has set a day for judging the world with justice by the man he has appointed, and he proved to everyone who this is by raising him from the dead. At the end of this wonderful speech, hundreds of sermons have been written, books about this one little sermon. At the end of this little sermon, saying these great things about God of creation and the universe, and we have our being in him. And he says, and he proves it by raising Jesus from the dead. Jesus is always the final proof. Even when Jesus was here, he was saying all these things about God. My Father's like this, my Father's like this. How do people know for sure? And then Jesus nails it by dying and then coming out again. And God is the one who is able to bring him back to life. That is the proof that all the other things Jesus said about God were true. That God is the one. If you really want life, it's only from God. In him we live and move and have our other being. All the other gods are only stone. Only this God is the one who has life. How do you know? He brought Jesus from the dead. Jesus is always the final word. He is always the answer to every important question. What is God really like? What will happen if I don't live a life with God? What will happen if I do this? Look at the cross. Jesus is the answer to every important question. He's the final word. Amen? What is the answer that I have come with for the person who asked me the question this week? Do you have to take the name? Or can you just be non-denominational and believe, but don't take the name? Don't have to join this group of people. Didn't have time to prepare long. I'll just tell you what I said. Been thinking about it a lot this week. I just said, I don't know how you can be saved. That's between you and God. But I said, for you to allow somebody somewhere in the past to now affect your relationship with God. Don't let them have their claws in you. You are still making decisions based upon what they said, what their attitudes were. You own your relationship with God and your relationship with the church by yourself. Stand tall and say, I will not let anybody else control who I am and how I think. I will nail my relationship with God for myself. Be strong enough to stand and say, this is what I believe. I will not let you interpret this, spin this any way you want. I control that. But what I'd like to say today that I didn't think through so quickly that day, God is looking for Pauls who are willing to stand up on Mars Hill and come out of the shadows and speak for him. God is looking for people who walk the streets of Athens, who live in the real world, who can see things and hear things and say, that is not okay. I just cannot live with that. And somehow that passion rises up and they're no longer afraid and they speak up for God. God is looking for Mars Hill people who will not stay in the shadows, who are willing to stand up and speak and defend him. And God, without fear, as I don't care what anyone thinks, I'm not afraid of being embarrassed, I will speak up for God. I said, God is looking for a church. We're trying to be a Mars Hill church that is willing to speak up for God. We defend the character of God. It all comes down to your picture of God. We think God has given this church something special to do, this particular church. We think the Garden Grove Church has come to a place in the history of Orange County in the Adventist Church. This is our time. And God has called us to come out of the shadows and be a Mars Hill church. And we will stand. We will not be afraid to live in the real world. We're not hiding. We're not going out to the country. We are here in the middle of city. And we will stand for the character of God and say, God is like this. Pastor Garrett. All of a sudden realized this is my last sermon to Pastor Garrett. Because in a moment of weakness, I'll let him have the farewell sermon next week. He may invite me someday to his ordination 4 or 5 years from now. If he does everything I've taught him the last 2 years. We have been blessed to have this young man in our church. So today was my ordination sermon to you. Assuming you'll probably let your father or your grandfather or Randy Roberts or someone else speak at your ordination. So just in case, I'm retired and in Tonga somewhere, I have spoken to you, my word. We had a search committee 2 years ago. And at the end of a long list of names, I said to the conference representative, I said, if there's one name on this list that 20 years from now, if we don't take them, we'll be sorry. And they said, probably Garrett Spire. It's a Holy Spirit moment. We called him, 21-year-old kid out of college. I knew his father, didn't know him well. And we have been blessed to have this young man here in our church for 2 years. He has phenomenal gifts that God has given to him. It's not fair. He's got music, he's got sports, He can dunk a basketball. He can preach his heart out, his personality. And hair. It's just not fair. Anyway, we've been blessed to have him. I can only do so much for him. We've given him money for his resources. I've done the best I could to pass on grace and a picture of God to this young man. And so I will say to you, Garrett, we are sending you to Loma Linda, and you will grow and you will learn many things, and you will develop and you will be fantastic. But I hope that the foundation we have tried to give you here is in your soul and in your DNA. Is that when you hear things that just are not the best about God, something will rise up in your soul. It'll be a knife in your heart, and you will be a Mars Hill preacher, and you will stand up and you will speak and tell the truth about God. You will do it in Loma Linda Academy chapels. You will do it in your youth group. You will do it in weeks of prayer wherever you are invited to go. And whatever else you add for the rest of your life, this is in your soul. You are a Paul, you are a Mars Hill preacher, and you are not afraid because you know what God is really like. May you be a powerful preacher for the character of God. Okay? God bless you. My brother.